We're really glad to be able to join together here to discuss, I think, some fundamentally important issues. We have heard with great excitement about all of the wonderful steps that have been taken in this generation in propelling this mobile innovation ecosystem that we all care deeply about. Think of the stats. We know some of them. There are now more mobile subscribers than people in the world. I heard a wonderful statistic recently that if you actually weighed all of the iPhones globally, they would be the equivalent of about 10,000 six-ton elephants. And I would like to remind you that only 5% of the world's phones have an Apple on them. So that's a whole bunch of more elephants that are out there. By the end of the decade, the data traffic on connected devices, the so-called Internet of Things, is projected to actually be double all global internet data traffic last year. So there are remarkable steps that are being taken. And I asked the question, what are the ingredients, the catalysts for this growth? What is actually becoming the wind in the sails of this phenomenon? And I think there are three things that we need to point to. One, of course, spectrum, infrastructure, clearly, and the apps and content and services that exist on the top layer of those. The second is investment, finance, the capital and debt markets that have and must continue to maintain a significant commitment to this ecosystem. The third is wise government policy frameworks. Absolutely indispensable, existentially indispensable to the kind of progress that we've seen and the continued progress that we hope to see. And it is in fact this trigonometry, the relationship within this triangle of infrastructure, investment, finance, and government that we're here today to try to explore, to assess how the relationships within this triangle should be properly balanced, how they can be reasonably and appropriately sustained, how the interaction between these three components can harmoniously and effectively proceed in the days ahead. And I've got to say, I am absolutely delighted and really glad the guests that we have to help us explore this trigonometry. Not only our colleagues from Wall Street and the world of economic analysis, but I'd like to start here with introducing our colleague, our friend, Ajit Pai. Commissioner Pai has, in his short tenure so far at the Commission, very positively leaned into his assignment. He brings to his work at the Commission a rich understanding and expertise in all three branches of government. I think the kind of accretive experience that he's brought in the Senate, Department of Justice, also at the FCC in a previous administration, really has been really strong foundations for him to build already a very significant intellectual reputation within the Commission and for all of those who care about this mobile innovation ecosystem. But I also think it's important to point out where he comes from. Parsons, Kansas. Population 10,454, according to my Google search that I did just before the lunch. Parsons, I think, growing up, and didn't actually explore it with us, living in a rural community and the importance that the infrastructure and spectrum and the broadband access that necessarily is increasingly important to communities like Parsons all around our country. It would be interesting for you to share with us. But I know that Parsons is no stranger to technology and technology leadership. In fact, I read, thanks to you, Dr. Google, that Wayne's photo is the very last place in all of the United States to process Kodachrome film. The very last frame from the last roll of Kodachrome film is printed in Parsons, Kansas. It's also home of the University of Kansas Center for Cognitive Disabilities, where they're really moving forward aggressively on advancing the cutting edge of assistive technologies for the cognitively developmentally disabled, an area which we know is significantly supported and sustained by the most pioneering innovations in mobile and wireless, providing assistive technologies and means wirelessly to make meaningful differences in people's lives. And that is part of your narrative and part of the Parsons narrative story. So welcome very much, Commissioner. Thank you. Let me ask, in fact, we are at an important day. One of your presumptive colleagues, Mr. O'Reilly, is in his hearing right now, or soon. And I'd like to just start by your sort of assessment of what it will mean to have not only him, but soon Tom Wheeler, composing a full panel at the Commission, and what that's actually going to mean for the pace of progress of the Commission's work.
Oh, that's a great question. Before I get to the answer, though, let me first thank you, Jonathan, and thank Mobile Future for having me at this event. It is very difficult to understate the importance of the message that Mobile Future has brought to this space. In fact, it's difficult to think of a group more presciently named than Mobile Future, because that really is where our industry is going. The Pew Internet Center recently released a report saying that 63% of all mobile users use their cell phones to go online, especially among the young. It is disproportionate that a lot of them now use mobile exclusively to access the internet. And so there's a tremendous future in mobile, and I think your group captures that zeitgeist quite well. With respect to the kind mention of Parsons, I would be remiss in not noting that I think everyone in this country would agree that from Silicon Valley, in addition to Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, Parsons is becoming a tech hub for the United States, and I hope that continues into the future. But with respect to your question, we have been operating a little bit short-staffed over the last couple of months. We have done a lot of work in a number of different areas, including the wireless space. But it would be terrific to have our two putative colleagues, Tom Wheeler and Mike O'Reilly, join the Commission. And Mike, as you mentioned, is having his confirmation hearing this afternoon, and I certainly wish him well and hope the confirmation process for him and for Tom goes smoothly. In part, that's, I will confess, because of my own selfish interest, there's a lot for the FCC to be doing, from the incentive auctions to some of the other spectrum issues on our plate. Infrastructure continues to be an important issue, and by tradition, the Commission only tackles some of those higher profile issues once we have a full complement of commissioners. And so I think it's going to be a tremendous amount, especially with respect to big ticket items like the incentive auctions.
Well, Tom Wheeler, like yourself, is a deeply experienced man, but you have one area of expertise which he doesn't have, which is actually being a commissioner at the FCC. Yeah. You've ramped up in your own tenure at the Commission. What advice would you give him? What points on the board do you think he should be focusing on in the first 100 days or so of his chairmanship as he's finally getting into the building?
Well, I certainly would not be so bold as to proffer my own advice to Tom, given the fact that he has deep experience in this industry. And, as I think I've mentioned elsewhere, he's probably forgotten more about this industry and managing a large organization than I ever would know. But that said, having served at the FCC for about 16 months, just two basic pieces of advice that I would give him, and I'm sure he's already internalized. Number one, you try to figure out what the most important issues on the FCC's agenda are, and to some extent that's no secret, the incentive auction being first among them. But secondly, also act with a sense of decisiveness. I think that one of the complaints I've heard about the FCC from the investment community, from just people in the public, is that a lot of times the FCC tackles the big issues, but it doesn't actually resolve them. And so one of the things I've heard about Tom, and I've gotten a chance to know him in the last couple of months, and I'm confident he will exhibit this trait once he arrives at the agency, is that a sense of dispatch in accomplishing the mission is critical. I think it sends a good signal to the investment community, to providers, and to consumers that the FCC is going to remain relevant in a good way for the time to come.
Well, and I think that's wise in prescription, particularly as the markets and the innovation ecosystem are chomping at the bit to move forward aggressively in expanding services, expanding infrastructure. In fact, if we can dive right now into the substance of our conversation, can we put up the slide of M&A activity? I don't know if you can see it, but what it shows is an almost historic level of deal-making within the wireless telecommunications world. In fact, it was roughly, market cap of deals this year is roughly $250 billion. It's almost as much as the last historic moment was 2006. In all global M&A activity, telecoms comprises about 15% of all M&A activity. It's remarkable. I mean, just in the last few weeks, we've heard of historic record-setting deals, $130 billion deal at Verizon and Vodafone, which was very, very quickly embraced by the leveraged finance, by the debt finance markets, in investable-grade corporate bond issuances that very, very enthusiastically was received in the marketplace. There is tremendous exuberance out there. I guess the question I would ask is that irrational exuberance, or is it foretelling a story of continued growth and dynamism in the sector?
A great question. Well, I think the level of activity that you see depicted on the chart, to me at least, from my perch at the FCC, underscores two basic things that I've tried to keep in mind during my tenure there. Number one, that this really is the most dynamic sector of the economy. Obviously, I'm biased. I've spent quite some time in this industry, but I really do think, by comparison to some of the other more regulated industries, that telecom has really led the way. And I think there are a lot of synergies there that we're seeing investors take advantage of, which leads to the second thing that I try to keep in mind. I studied at the University of Chicago many moons ago, and at the time, one of the prominent faculty members was Ronald Coase, who recently passed away. And one of the things that he posited was that the initial allocation of a property right doesn't really matter so long as the transaction costs are low. But when there are transaction costs, then the importance of regulation and law becomes paramount. And especially in the context of transactional review, one of the things that I've tried to advocate at the FCC is that we stick to the merits of the transaction. We don't insert more transaction costs than there need to be. And if that continues to be the case, what you're going to see is a lot of people taking more risks in terms of investment that ultimately will benefit consumers, because they know that regulators aren't going to stand in the way, whether it's in terms of delaying transactions altogether, or adding extraneous conditions, otherwise mitigating the value of these value-maximizing deals. And I hope that my colleagues will embrace the same view. One
of the great challenges for the investment community, for capital and debt market participants, is to actually weigh and assign what kind of risk is imposed, in fact, by regulation, by political processes. And one of the challenges and one of the opportunities it would seem for the FCC is to try to mitigate some of that risk. What can the FCC do to shape the glide path for continued investment and robust financial support of our mobile wireless ecosystem on markets?
That is the $64,000 question. I think some of the solutions, and this will sound very basic to those of you who don't have the privilege of appearing before the FCC, is simply codifying in our rules some basic principles. Number one, sticking to deadlines. So we have an informal 180-day shot clock that has generally been honored in the breach over the past many years, and I think it would help for us to put that into our rules so that it's an official deadline. Similarly, I think we should, as I said earlier, focus our transactional review to the merits of the transaction. I think quite often what people see is that when they try to get a deal through Washington is that the antitrust authorities, whether it's the FTC or the DOJ, might scrutinize the competitive effects of a particular transaction in a geographic market, whereas the FCC, because we administer a more flexible, one might say, public interest test with respect to transactions, there's sort of a Christmas tree effect. Everyone comes in and says, okay, I want this condition, I want that condition, even if the condition isn't necessarily related to the transaction. It might be good as a matter of policy, but isn't related to the transaction. So I think focusing on the merits of the transaction and narrowly tailoring conditions to address competitive harms would be a good thing. And otherwise, keeping an open mind, if there are different ways to streamline or review these transactions, our office at least is certainly open to all ideas.
It would seem as well that to unblock a lot of these processes also would create greater opportunity for addressing more meaningfully spectrum crunch issues. Absolutely. There are, the adage is that there are three inevitabilities in life: death, taxes, and birth. There's a fourth, which is that the FCC moves slowly and deliberately on all things. But in that context, what more can the Commission do to actually make significantly more progress in addressing spectrum issues? And what do you think are the guiding lights that we should be looking towards?
So in addition to some of the more process-oriented reforms I was talking about, setting deadlines and meeting them, I think it is incumbent on us to really have an aggressive, forward-thinking approach to spectrum. I was very heartened recently that our Wireless Telecommunications Bureau announced that the auction for the H-block spectrum, that's 1915 to 1920, 1995 to 2000, as you know, megahertz, is going to be auctioned in January of 2014. That's terrific for any number of reasons. Most notably, number one, we haven't held a major spectrum auction since 2008, and you don't need me to tell you that consumer demand has only intensified over those 5 years. Number two, I think it's important for us, frankly, just to get some points on the scoreboard, so to speak. I think a lot of people are wondering, does the FCC have the will and the ability to really match the supplied spectrum to the demand of it? And I think this H-block auction, although it represents only a 10 megahertz slice, is important. And finally, this is more because of the congressional priorities that have been set for us. We are under a mandate to fund the construction of a nationwide public safety network that's interoperable and based on broadband. We can't do that if we don't have revenue. And the H-block auction, I think, is a great opportunity for us to generate some of that revenue.
As long as we're reviewing specific auctions, look ahead a little bit more towards the AWS-3 auction. Anything you'd like to prognosticate?
Sure. I mean, we issued an NPRM on this issue recently, and I'm hopeful that the coordination that's been going on thus far with the federal users, especially the Department of Defense, will continue and will be productive. T-Mobile has put a forward-thinking plan on the table, but there's still quite a bit of work to do, and I think it's going to be imperative for us to really keep our eye on the prize. And in my view, the prize is clearing that spectrum from 1755 to 1780, pairing it with 2155 to 2180, and then auctioning it. That is, of course, prime spectrum. It's internationally harmonized for use. We could deploy it pretty quickly. And even more than H-block, as important as H-block is, I think 1755 is a tremendous opportunity for us to advance wireless services in this country.
Is there a broader role for the FCC in pushing the edges of the envelope and getting more compliance, more productivity from government agencies and complying with not only presidential executive orders, but reallocating spectrum for consumer use, particularly in places like the Defense Department? In your view, what is the proper role for the FCC? Should it be leaning in more aggressively? And what kind of incentives can actually be structured to get more progress?
The last piece of that answer is the most important, trying to offer enough incentives so that the dialogue with federal users is a productive one as opposed to an adversarial one. Thus far, I think we have cooperated very well with our colleagues at NTIA and the other federal agencies. One of the things I called for in March, for example, was for the FCC to kick off the process under this Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act that starts the 18-month process for identifying some of the spectrum that we want to auction, then working collaboratively with federal users. And that process, I think, has been pretty good. It worked out pretty well so far, and I hope that continues into the future. But certainly there are going to be a lot of difficulties. I don't think, I'm sure I speak for my colleagues, and I would think for the commercial sector too, when I say that we don't want federal users to have to compromise the importance of their mission in terms of spectrum use. And so we want to work with them to make sure that they are able to accomplish what they need to accomplish to keep us safe and to keep the country secure, while at the same time recognizing that growing consumer demand needs to be accommodated somehow. So I think there's a way to square the circle if we work within the confines of the CSEA in a way that is collaborative, and we've done that so far, I think.
Now, of course, one of the most promising initiatives that have been undertaken by the FCC in close coordination with Congress are what have been called the historic incentive auctions for the 600 megahertz band that we're anticipating. All eyes are on the FCC, not just eyes in Washington, but also I think that the capital debt markets are looking very closely at what is going to unfold. These are important. They're amongst the most complicated auctions ever anticipated, the design for which is an exquisitely challenging process. It's a 9-bank billiard shot with one stroke of the cue to get it right. That design process is underway. And there's a conversation about whether the design principles should be restrictive or open. I'd like to hear your views if you were developing that blueprint yourself and had the writ to do it on your own. What would that blueprint look like, and how would you structure this?
Great question. So I could certainly filibuster with all the details about the preferred band plan and the repacking design and what have you. But I guess the 5 basic principles that I would bring to the task would be, number one, stick with the terms of the statute. That is obvious, of course, but that's never more important than here, where we have a very recently enacted law that gives us the authority to conduct these auctions. Secondly, I think it's important for us to let the market, rather than government fiat, drive how the auction is structured. So with respect to broadcasters, that means, for example, not setting an artificial score that would inadvertently, I would argue, limit their incentive to participate in the auction. Similarly, it means letting all companies participate in forward auction. That means not restricting within the incentive auction proceedings who can bid on what spectrum. That means in the context of the companion spectrum aggregation proceeding, not adopting an unduly strict vision of what spectrum holdings should be. Third, I would argue that we have to be fair to all stakeholders, both broadcasters and wireless companies. I think one of the underappreciated features of the current incentive auction proceedings is how well the two sides have collaborated in terms of, especially getting together to adopt or to propose a consensus band plan. And that's a consensus I think we should embrace, and we should be fair to both sides going forward. Fourth, we should try to accomplish all of this within a reasonable time frame. One of the most common questions I get in terms of the incentive auction is, when are you going to hold it? And I think the uncertainty that's surrounding this issue doesn't serve the industry very well, certainly doesn't serve the investment community very well, doesn't serve us very well either, because Congress and the public is always asking questions about it. So I think it's important for us to get it done right and get it done as soon as we can. If we adopt all of those things and stick with, most importantly, I would argue, the fifth principle, which is to understand the opportunities and limitations of physics. I think a lot of band plans have been put out there, a lot of different ideas for what we can do with the duplex gap, with guard bands, spectrum below channel 37. All great ideas, but we have to remember that technical feasibility is really the rate limiting step here, because if we adopt a very elegant band plan that the carriers don't like, that the chip manufacturers don't want to work with, that the broadcasters don't see as feasible, this is going to fail from the get-go. So those 5 principles, I think, will yield a successful incentive auction if we maintain fidelity to them.
And we join in hoping that the other area where there's also a fierce urgency of now the Commission is facing, but the nation is facing, is the inevitable transition that we must take towards an all-IP network, Internet Protocol network. Progress is underway, much work ahead of us. It's important, obviously, not only to be able to equip and provide American consumers with the kind of strong and increasingly robust networks that an all-IP infrastructure will provide, but also will free up, in so doing, it seems to me, the kind of free cash flow that will allow even more directed investment in strengthening and building out these networks and making access more of a reality. What is the progress so far at the FCC in driving forward on this project, and what more can be done?
Well, along with the transition from fixed to mobile, I would argue the most fundamental technological change we're seeing in our country right now, and probably that we've seen since, frankly, telephones became widespread in this country, is the migration from legacy technologies like copper to IP-based technologies like fiber. And that holds a tremendous opportunity, I think, for industry and consumers alike. Now, there are going to be some challenges, of course, but one of the reasons why I focus so much on the IP transition since I started is that I think that there is a lot of that the FCC can do to get it right. To get it right, I think it's critical for us to proactively look at all of our regulations and try to figure out which ones are no longer necessary in an all-IP world, or which ones are holding back investment in next generation technologies. And so last summer, for example, I proposed the FCC started an IP transition task force, and we did that in December. That task force has been doing tremendous work. And the next step now, I think, is to start all IP trials. So one of the things I proposed, for example, is having an all IP pilot program where providers can voluntarily select a discrete set of wire centers, turn off some of their TDM-based architecture, and migrate to IP. And then we, the FCC, can study what works and what doesn't. If there's a problem, we can try to find a solution. And if the parade of horribles doesn't materialize, and that's useful information too. I would note that a majority of the current commission now has endorsed location-specific IP trials, and I'm hopeful that that particular step, which I think will yield further progress on the IP transition, will be undertaken in the near future.
You mentioned putting points on the board, and substantively there have been significant points that have been put on the board recently with the interoperability deal.
Yeah.
So transiting to that area, what are your thoughts on that deal, and what should we be keeping our eyes on as it moves forward?
Good question. So I think as a general matter, I'm certainly of the view that a voluntary agreement among private parties is always preferable to a government mandate, especially in an area where the industry is so dynamic as it is, and number two, where the FCC's authority to issue such a mandate is relatively circumscribed. And so I'm hopeful that this agreement augurs some sort of resolution that's favorable to everybody, certainly the providers in the 700, as well as consumers who rely on 700, and that going forward, that agreement is hashed out in a way that's fair to everybody. I think long term, actually, that if assuming we solve the Channel 51 problem, that all of this will become a happy footnote in the history of the wireless industry. But,
yeah,
we'll see.
Well, thank you. In talking about happy footnotes, I actually not make it a footnote, I make it a headline that I understand you're having a baby in October. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much.
And you know, as a dad, you know that you're now using a lot of these cool devices to do a lot of cool things. Deeply substantive question: what's the coolest new gadget app or device that you, Commissioner Pai, have been? You don't have to use a brand name.
Okay. Boy, that's a good question. So, well, I will say I've been shocked, probably unpleasantly so, at how easy my son has found. My son just turned 2 years old. To use these devices. I found it the other day. He just unlocked our iPad and pulled up the photo app and started scrolling through photos, and he started a video of himself, which is terrifying. Having grown up in the era of TVs without remote controls, I'm just flabbergasted how much things have changed. But in terms of apps, the one app I would certainly love to see, especially after October 11th when our daughter is due, is an app that allows parents to get sleep no matter what the circumstances in the household.
I will invest in that.
I
will be an early round investor.
I hope so, but just some of the basic video apps have been really helpful to us when our little guy's a little cranky. Being able to pull up a Sprout video of the Good Night show is just has been a godsend to his sleep-deprived mom and dad. So, but there's so many apps that I've relied on over the last several years. My wife and I were stranded in Jaipur a few years ago, and we were able to pull up the kayak app to buy tickets on the spot to get us back to Delhi when there wasn't any other transportation available. My wife had me put up some stuff around the house. I was able to use my app as a leveler to make sure I didn't screw things up too much. It's really incredible, and I think it's hard when you're in the midst of such rapid change to appreciate how far we have come. And that is a testament to everybody in this industry, not just the companies that provide these services, but the investors who take the risks, the regulators who pave the way for innovation. And I can only wait with eager eyes, both as a regulator and as a consumer, what the future portends.
Well, thank you very, very much for those comments. If it's okay with you, I'd like to see if there might be questions from our colleagues here.
Sure.
Does anybody want to pose a question or make a comment on anything you might have heard?
Solved all the industry's problems. Terrific.
Please, and if you could, if you don't mind, introduce yourself and tell us where you're from.
Hi, I'm Julie Rones, and I've been a telecom attorney for many years in the industry, and I really welcome innovative ideas to allow this industry to thrive, and it's very important, and I just welcome your views. I just was curious as to whether or not this is futuristic and in terms of the FCC seat for the other Republican candidate who is going through his hearing today.
Yeah.
I know you're probably welcoming a colleague on the commission, a new colleague. I just wondered if you had worked with him before and just how you see the FCC evolving in the future. Thank you.
Sure, good questions all. So starting with Mike in particular, I was serving in the Senate at the same time as him back between 2003 and 2007. I didn't have the opportunity to work with him, although we had a number of friends in common, and I've gotten a chance to meet with him since he became a nominee, and I can tell you that I'm pretty confident that he will bring his expertise in this field and his experience working with the legislative branch to the commission. That'll be an asset to all of us, not just me as a Republican, but the commission writ large. I would also add that a lot of people ask me if it's been lonely over at the FCC, being the only Republican, and obviously, being the only one there, you feel you're aware of that. But I've got to say that my two colleagues and I have worked really well in a whole variety of issues, from the wireless space to the media space, and we are very lucky that we work at an agency that is not rife with some of the internecine disputes you see in other agencies, and we don't. Not everything is a massive partisan disagreement. There are going to be cases where we disagree, but by and large, our goals are the same. We all want to incentivize investments to boost innovation in this industry and ultimately deliver better products and services to consumers. So it'll be great to have Mike on board, qua commissioner, not so much qua Republican, in my view.
one more quick question if somebody would like to pose one. Well, with that, I will say two things. One, an unknown thing about Commissioner Ajit Pai is that not only is he forcefully establishing a very, very important platform for himself, a unique voice in our industry as an innovator, but he's also a really good curator of poetry.
Yeah.
In fact, when we first met each other, we learned that we chose the same stanza from the same Walt Whitman poem, Song of the Open Road, to read at our wedding. So you've very good taste.
Thank you, sir.
And on behalf of all of my co-board members at Mobile Future, on behalf of our staff at Mobile Future, on behalf of all of us, we really thank you for your time and the work that you've been doing for our industry.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks again for having me. I've been really appreciative of all you've done, and I don't know if you remember this, but Jonathan and I had a really important conversation, to me at least, before I became a commissioner, in which I asked him for his advice, and he told me, you might remember this, just really dig into the issues and understand that there is no substitute for understanding the full complexity of the engineering, economic, and other aspects of a problem. And I've tried to do that over the last several months, especially in the context of the incentive auctions, bringing in all the parties, really sitting down with their CTOs, their engineers, and figuring out what's possible. And I owe that in part to you, because it's easy for me to pontificate since I have a platform, but to pontificate knowledgeably is a much greater challenge in my case. So I appreciate all you've done for me, all that Mobile Future has done for our industry, and look forward to working with you in the months ahead.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. So I mentioned that part of this trigonometry, part of the relationships within this triangle, an important node of that are obviously the capital market participants, those who analyze the securities that are being transacted on those markets, those who are investing in those securities, and those who are economists who are helping us understand the dynamics that are driving these markets and our industry. And we really have a terrific group of colleagues to help us understand some of these issues in the context of spectrum valuation and this dynamic mobile marketplace that we are experiencing. Roger Antner is founder of Recon Analytics. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you for having me.
Jennifer Fritchie is managing director at Wells Fargo Security, and I believe you've been covering the telecoms industry, both wireless and wireline, for 14 years?
That's right, actually 15.
15 years.
Right.
Congratulations. Thank you. And Lisa Mullen is down from Boston and an equity analyst with Adage Capital Management, one of the larger asset management firms in Boston, and has been covering and investing in telecoms for 14 years.
That's right, so Jennifer's got me beat.
We have quite a lot of experience. Let me dive right into the deep end of the conversation. I posed the question to Commissioner Pai that there seems to be a real surfeit of M&A activity deals, both on the secondary markets but also in the public markets. What do you think are driving this level of M&A activities? And from capital markets perspective, what lessons should we be drawing about this moment in M&A history as it relates to the telecoms industry?
I can jump in on that. I think that first and foremost, that with interest rates so low and about to move up, now is the time to strike if you want to do a deal, because the debt markets are open and there's cheap finance out there. And I believe that's why, in particular, we saw the vote from Verizon deal happen after that negotiation took place for 10 years, and that was a huge part of the dollar amount of M&A we've seen so far. I think there's two other reasons why we see M&A. I think that when you're dealing with an industry that requires scale to succeed, and you're about to face another huge investment cycle, or we're in process in an investment cycle, it makes sense to do your transaction before you actually deploy a lot of dollars. Mm-hmm. So I believe that's why we saw AT&T try to buy T-Mobile. And I believe that's also why Dish probably is looking for a suitor at this point, or as one of its options.
To bake in the accessibility of interest rates now, obviously is a key driver, but are there other more intrinsic drivers as well, which is capital markets and debt markets responding favorably to the development of the telecom sector, where capacity is being invested in heavily and where consumer demand is growing at leaps and bounds? What are the other inputs that are driving, you think, M&A, despite the very favorable interest rates, which are attracting investment grade corporate?
I think Lisa hit it on the head in terms of scale. I think there were a lot of questions about Verizon's purchasing of Vodafone, you know, this concern about pricing environment with now T-Mobile coming alive. Why would they quote unquote double down on the industry right now? You know, I think, well, I know I'm one of the more favorable ones on AT&T and Verizon. I think that the moves they made last year in terms of the pricing changes, they kind of shed the skin of being a dumb pipe. But again, to that point, it's really all about scale. And so now I think you have Sprint and playing catch up here, maybe T-Mobile to some extent. I think you also have to mention Spectrum being a very finite asset. You know, Clearwire is probably the evidence for that. And I think that, I don't want to speak for the carriers, but I don't think they're overly optimistic in terms of timing of new Spectrum coming from Washington. So they have felt the need to act in the secondary market.
And I really want to reiterate what was said before, that we're really at this break point with new technology coming on board, LTE, which is like a reset button, where the dynamics in the market are really rearranged anew, where opportunities are really plentiful. And we can see it, for example, with the new T-Mobile.
Correct.
Within 6 months, they cover half of the country with LTE. They're now at 190 million, almost 2/3. They are growing again. It's really the right time to come in as the cards are being reshuffled and distributed anew.
Well, let me, if I can expand on the international component, Roger, you have a good perspective on this. There are significant variations in, on a pro rata basis, of investment levels within the European markets and here in the United States. Now, like Cross and others are trying to address that with consolidation of markets, but what do you think accounts for the fact that we've been able to continue to invest at a much higher rate per capita in 4G LTE and see broader investment levels within the United States markets compared to principal OECD, in particular the EC markets?
Well, Americans are using wireless a lot more intensively than anybody else in the world. The adoption of smartphones has really happened in this country first, and we have taken up the leadership in the world. We've also, Americans see value in it, so they're spending more than people in a lot of other countries, but they're using it dramatically more. So the cost per unit of what we consume in this country is substantially less than anywhere else in the OECD world. When we have investors looking in from the outside, may it be SoftBank of Japan or Deutsche Telekom, which reinvested in the United States, they pay credit to that, and they see this as an open, competitive market where, yes, they're going to spend $25 billion, but they see really the payback there and the opportunity to succeed, like nowhere else in the world.
Well, let me broaden now to a question more about the overall pace of growth in the marketplace. So we're told that the accretion of subscriber levels is growing at just over 2%. It's not a significant amount. But there still are companies that are regularly and serially voting positively with their checkbooks into this marketplace, as well as the capital and the debt markets. Where do you see, and where do you think they see, that we're going to be the key drivers of growth in the wireless marketplace? What are going to be the sub-verticals, healthcare, education, smart grid, Internet of Things, the number of platforms that people are buying that are going to be driving this growth that account for this increasingly sustainable level, it seems, of investment?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. This is not about your traditional wireless phone usage anymore. The postpaid, traditional postpaid and prepaid base is mature. It's growing 2% a year. And LTE is not about how we used to use the phone. It's about bringing video and being a broadband substitute. It's about a lot of technologies utilizing that spectrum in ways that we can't even dream of right now. So the revenue growth is not going to come from what we know. It's going to come from the doors that are being opened by enabling these fast pipes that don't need a copper or fiber tail.
Jennifer, what's your perspective?
And I would just add to that, I've said this before, but you know, nowadays I can see the clients I meet are not just dedicated telco buy-siders, as we call them, like Lisa, but rather people who are more generalists who just want to know about this space because they hear, you know, every other industry is talking about mobility being their future, even though they're not a telecom company per se. So I think to Lisa's point, it's just this kind of, it's no longer a subscriber game. It's, you know, do I go from being 100% penetrated to 400% penetrated, and my children the same thing, and my husband the same. So as a family, you know, we are much more penetrated. And that is like, I think Verizon probably coined it best, kind of changing the vernacular to more from ARPU, average revenue per user, to ARPA, as they're calling it, average revenue per account, and kind of increasing that wallet share of the typical user.
But, you know, I think there's still room to grow. While, yes, we have 110% wireless penetration, if we look at it as in terms of people penetration, we're probably only 78% penetrated. And if we look at it, what is really possible, it's probably 90%. If we drive down you know, when does everybody get a mobile device, say at age 10? So there's not only room for more connections per person, but also to drive it more deeply into the population, both age-wise upwards. As people age, the penetration automatically goes up as the people with devices continue to go up in age, and also to go down. You know, I know it's a nightmare scenario for some parents, you know, as they go younger and younger. So there's this room, and you know, I think some of the carriers are going, like AT&T is going very aggressively into home automation, where home security, which is a completely seemingly unrelated field, but where the engines and the synergies are really there. They're very defendable because it's very hard to get in, but then, you know, wireless can really, you know, provide competition and innovation in a segment that has been largely stagnant.
But let's turn, if we could, because we've all spoken a little bit about spectrum. Let's really focus on spectrum for a little while. Starting with this principle, and Ajib was very clear about the real and present danger of proceeding towards a spectrum crunch. It's true the FCC, the White House, Congress have put their collective shoulders to the problem. But from where you sit, as capital market participants, as analysts, as investors, how would you grade the efforts that are underway here in Washington in addressing this challenge? You know, we still are riding at about 85% capacity. What more needs to be done? And how are the markets, in fact, you know, evaluating what kind of risk discount is being taken because of this spectrum problem that we're facing?
Okay, yeah, that's a loaded question, but a good one. I think it's a real fear. I alluded to the fact that the carriers, I would say in the most politically correct way, are not overly optimistic about the spectrum coming to market, are having to think outside the box. I think AT&T is a perfect example. The 2.3 spectrum that's now a major pillar in their LTE strategy. 5 years rewind, they never even talked about it. In fact, I didn't even know they owned it, and I had followed AT&T for 10 years. So they're having to think outside the box. And I think really when AT&T got the iPhone in 2007, I think Verizon, if they were being totally honest, would say it was a lucky miss because they could see what AT&T had to endure to play catch up. And I think that scared a lot of people, or carriers. You know, then you bring in the dialogue of Clearwire and all of that. So I think that there's, you know, I heard AT&T say this last week, that AT&T spectrum's like money, you can never have enough. I've heard them say, you know, at times I thought I overpaid for spectrum. Now in hindsight, I realize I didn't. So I think that that is on the forefront of all of their minds because they kind of see this edge, you know, cliff.
Would you like to add to that?
Sure. To add on, I just feel like there's a lot of deal making and aggregating going on under the facade of maybe I'll build a new network, maybe I won't, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of scrambling to pick up the pieces and put the industry, or to put the spectrum back together in a sellable form. So it's not just the FCC who's very clearly, talking to all of us about their plans and bringing spectrum to market. There's such a sense of urgency that you see private equity companies and also public companies act as deal makers and spectrum aggregators. And that's interesting. I mean, that speaks to the sense of urgency.
Well, and if in fact spectrum is like money, I guess one of the key issues one faces is the evaluative one. How do you value that money? And there have been recently various kinds of valuation frameworks for spectrum. I recall JP Morgan, for example, issued a report that was submitted to the FCC where, in terms of the megahertz pop correlation, they suggested a couple of things. One, a valuation framework. It was seemingly somewhat low, but also the assignment of higher value to higher frequency. Sorry, lower value to higher frequency. It seems to have changed a bit in the last couple of secondary market transactions that have shifted that framework. Roger, do you want to?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we're seeing today is that we're really custom tailoring the application of the spectrum with the frequency band. And the valuation of lower frequency band supposed to be higher is actually not, I don't think we can see that in the real world. Because where the low frequency band is extremely useful is in the rural parts of the country, where you go for geographical coverage. Every carrier has basically solved that problem. You don't need to cover, the plain states anymore. The smaller the cells, the less important, and actually the more useful high frequency spectrum becomes. I always remember Dr. Saw, who was the CTO of Clearwire, always repeating that in Manhattan, a 2.5 megahertz network like what he has and what Sprint now has looks identical to a 700 megahertz spectrum because you are capacity constrained, not geographically constrained. And actually, it's more helpful to have higher frequency spectrum in densely populated areas because you're not interfering as easily. So just saying, oh, higher frequency spectrum is intrinsically less valuable. Yes, before we deployed wireless, that was certainly true. Today that we have wireless, I think the valuation becomes very, very similar, and it's more driven of what spectrum is available, I'll buy it. I don't care where it is on the frequency dial.
Thoughts on spectrum valuation frameworks, shifts, what you should be looking at?
I agree with everything, yet then you also have to call or consider the fact that Verizon has had a good amount of spectrum for sale for a long time. That's A-block spectrum. We all know about the Channel 51 interference, but it's kind of ironic when you consider they're all desperate for spectrum, yet that spectrum is just sat. And, I don't know if it's a fear of selling it for less than they bought it for, but there's little nuances. And I would agree with Roger that, you know, we were kind of brought up to believe lower band spectrum was good, you know, the beachfront property spectrum, and higher band spectrum is bad, and that line of thinking is definitely shifting.
And just bringing up the A block, a month ago investors thought that was pretty worthless, and then along came a technological advancement, and in a matter of a week or two, Verizon's looking pretty good.
That's
They
true,
know that
that's
still
true.
isn't a profit now.
Yes, that's right.
So, you know, the technological change has also changed the fate of the value of the spectrum. It's more dynamic than I think we originally gave, you know, credence to.
Well, and you know how valuable spectrum is. You know, Dan Hesse said a couple of weeks ago that by 2016 he will have coverage parity with Verizon. How he 15?
Yeah.
Oh boy! How he can do that with if the spectrum would be so so bad, and he has so much of the highest frequency spectrum, would be impossible.
Well, let me ask a question on that point. If as he said, if they will reach network parity by 2015, would it be wise, therefore, to not have the spectrum screen that would be the shifts in the spectrum screen that would essentially give wind in the sails to Sprint, which apparently is going to reach network parity with other providers?
I just want to clarify on the network parity. I mean, Sprint and T-Mobile have largely built out dense urban networks and haven't built out robust rural networks. So I would just assume those comments probably are more in the urban markets and not rural. So another separate question is, how do you know, what do we think about spectrum caps?
Right.
And
But it is a legitimate question asking for a revised set of rules regarding the spectrum screen. Should it be applicable if one of the key proponents of those revised sets of rules suggests that they're going to be at parity in significant markets with their competition?
Well, on a per subscriber basis, Sprint has 4 times the spectrum that roughly that AT&T and Verizon have, and twice the spectrum that that T-Mobile has on a per subscriber basis. And that's, I think, what really matters is how much spectrum per subscriber do you have, because that's what you're actually using. Of course, if you have more subscribers, you will need more spectrum. That goes without saying. And I don't think companies should be penalized for being successful.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I mean, I think you all might know better than me, I think they welcome shining light on that conversation, they meaning AT&T and Verizon. I mean, Verizon, I think, has publicly quantified the amount of subscribers they have in Manhattan alone. And, you know, if you want to just say from a spectrum basis, I don't know the number, I'm forgetting, 15 million customers in Manhattan versus Sprint, we can have that conversation. It's a very easy one, I think, in their mind to have.
well, I just was going to add, you could put caps on, but I also think you limit the capital investment that would happen on that spectrum, because, I mean, Verizon has spent, Sprint's touting how they're spending $8 billion over the last 2 years, going to $6 billion a year thereafter, whereas AT&T and Verizon have been spending that much, if not more, for the last 20 years. So, you know, you could start to manage the spectrum caps, but you also have this secondary market impact on capital spending that should be considered as well. And that also will then relate to the customer experience and the products that customers have. I mean, you don't want to cut off your hand.
Exactly. So if you take it to the extreme, you would be managing market share through spectrum screens. If you restrict the spectrum for carriers that have more subscriber per megahertz, then their experience will be inferior and they will go somewhere else who by happenstance have more spectrum per customer.
There's a related discussion that we touched on with Commissioner Pai, which about the design principles that are antecedent to the 600 megahertz incentive auctions, whether success should be penalized, whether these should adhere towards principles that are open, inclusive, or veer towards more of a restrictive approach. We have a if you could just turn your attention to a slide that we put up. It's based on an analysis that we asked economists to undertake, looking at how the application of restrictive frameworks for auction design have impacted auction results, proceeds, also to the extent to which spectrum ultimately was deployed. But the figures that you'll see are pretty clearly suggestive that at least in the international auctions that we looked at, that when there were restrictive frameworks, restrictive rules applied in auction design, proceeds actually underperformed targets, sometimes significantly. As economists, as market watchers, as investors, what lessons might we draw from not just these data, but also what is your perspective? What input would you give those designers at the FCC as they are doing right now the hard work figuring out whether whether the auction design will be open and inclusive or include restrictions?
It's a great question. And I don't envy their job, to say the least, after having some meetings this morning. But you know, if I'm reading this right, the percentage discount, I mean, from what I understand, you know, this incentive auction obviously has a lot of use. The dollars raised go to important things such as FirstNet, as well as anything after that toward deficit reduction. And with those two in mind, I think just restrictions, you know, you restrict the two gorillas, I think it gets harder to achieve those goals. I don't know.
Yeah, and the more restrictions you are imposing, the more, the less money you will get. And if you're, you know, as Jennifer said, gorillas, but if you're restricting AT&T as the 800-pound gorillas, you're ending up with two 600-pound gorillas. And as a small rural carrier, it doesn't matter if you get outbid by AT&T or in Verizon when you get outbid by Sprint and T-Mobile. The only ones who are being helped are Sprint and T-Mobile, and if we want to do that, then we should at least be honest about it. And you know, I think we saw even, take the 700 megahertz band. The more restricted the band and the more encumbered it was, the less money it went for. The C-band that Verizon bought had net neutrality rules at it. It sold for less than the B block that AT&T had, which was the highest, and the A block went for the least because it had the most problems and restrictions. So if your goal is to get a positive auction result and monetize it because you have important goals to achieve, like FirstNet, then you should apply the least possible or no restrictions to get the most money.
If the two largest carriers are pushing the envelope on innovation, and the United States has made enormous strides over the rest of the world in the last decade or so, because there have not been restrictions. If we were at a market, a point in time in the market where the envelope was no longer being pushed, I think maybe then you could consider restrictions to let the rest of the industry catch up. However, that's not what the case is today, and you've got to let these guys keep running, because last time I looked, their capital spending goes up by billions of dollars on wireless a year, and great things are happening.
There's also a theory that the FCC has ample enforcement tools post-auction to help mediate, mitigate, or deal with market harms and layers. So that's another point that has been pointed out. But I think it's useful and wise that inputs from market participants also come in, as they also come from places like the Department of Justice on this issue. Turning to another area of great excitement is the transition we mentioned, we discussed, towards an all-internet protocol infrastructure. Again, from a Wall Street economic perspective, what do you perceive to be the barriers towards achievement of an all-IP network and the benefits that will accrue from that transition once fully made. Thanks, Lisa.
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I think we all know that the traditional wireline network is heavily regulated, and there's carrier of last resort obligations, and which forces the carriers to deploy capital to meet these minimum service requirements. And from an investor's point of view, I think that these companies are discounted. Their valuations are discounted because a portion of the free cash flow every year that's allocated to capital spending has to go towards these older networks. So I think that the migration to IP is an advancement that would be great for the industry. I think it would save these companies a lot of money, and I think that as a result, these companies could obtain a higher valuation and therefore more free cash flow to deploy in the growth areas. That said, I agree with the commissioner that just spoke that we have to go slowly to make sure we don't disrupt service for people.
Yeah, I would agree with Lisa. Just from, just the Wall Street perspective, the model's margins would go higher. How much, quantifying that is still TBD, but it's directionally it would be a very good thing. But just stating the obvious, you really have to consider the consumer and the timing of the transition carefully and cautiously.
Well, it would simplify the network significantly, because you no longer have to run then two networks. Because right now there's a circuit switched voice network and a packet switched data network. When voice becomes, especially over VoLTE, becomes another data app, you have to run one network. So that really brings down costs and lets you realign and reassign investment. But I think the jump to VoLTE will be another innovative spark that will really bring to voice, which has been largely the same since Alexander Bell. Same thing. And when it becomes data, we will see a much better integration, and we will see the same thing that we saw for applications and data. We will see for voice as it becomes fully integrated into the app world. And right now, it's still, there's no voice innovation besides HD voice, which is just apply more bits. But I think we will see a much more vigorous, innovative energy coming out of VoLTE.
I just want to add one other point, is that there's significant cost savings. Price declines tend to follow. So if we're worried about the consumer not sharing in this benefit, I think the industry has proven out anytime there's been a lot of cost taken out of the industry, price benefits to the consumer have followed.
Well, you've been very both generous and incisive with your advice. Welcome to Washington. One of the big issues now, of course, is that the arrival of Chairman Wheeler. I posed the question to Commissioner Pai, what advice he would give him as he undertakes a pretty monumental assignment, a very complex assignment. I think it could be very interesting to hear, again, from the Wall Street and economic perspective, what advice would you give him as he ramps up in the first 100 days or so of his tenure at this very important moment in the evolution of these markets?
I thought Commissioner Pai's advice was dead on, I forget how he said it, but action needed. I think the FCC, for good or bad, for the last several years has had a reputation of speaking, not doing. And I think that most people who have experience with Wheeler would think the opposite. And so I think that's a very good thing.
I just think the one issue of understanding if we are going to have spectrum caps, or screens, whatever we want to call it, to clear that up quickly, and so everyone understands the rules that we're contending with as an investor. That changes my outlook on where I think stocks should be valued. I think it changes the outlook in terms of where companies that could be investing today might put dollars to work if they knew the rules. So that's just one issue I think is really key to clean up quickly, especially before the auction.
Yeah, I was just going to say probably before the auction, like first to-do list. I think that's key.
Well, I think we've never had an incoming chairman who was better prepared for that position than Tom Wheeler. And I think if he views this, if he doesn't forget what he learned and that what he got in there, I think we will be all well served, because he has a wealth of insight and experience, and if he relies on that, I think going forward we will have a very insightful and august chairman.
Auspicious and important advice, which I hope that will be transferred to him as he begins his tenure. Why don't we see if we have questions from our colleagues on any of the issues or new ones that you'd like to explore.
Quick
Please
question.
let us know who you are.
Sure. I'm Dave Roy with Global Life Consulting. We do consulting and advisory services across the U.S. and global. How does Wi-Fi and cloud play into the way the evolution is happening on the LTE side?
The cloud is simply, is a huge accelerator of data usage. So from that, it heavily drives investment. Wi-Fi is really a complementary offload in a lot of the fixed, especially urban locations. So more and more, the two of them work complementarily together.
Do you see a shift in focus from an ecosystem standpoint between the core providers and the rest of the ecosystem that's developing?
I think the big telecom providers are best positioned to put together really a seamless network. As if you have the small providers, you run into a patchwork solution that needs to be stitched together, and that's always fraught with problems. System integration is, I think, a never-ending cash cow and nightmare at the same time, and I think,
You don't see any cannibalization though?
No.
So it's all positive for every player?
Yeah.
Please, Christine.
Hi, Christine Crow at Wilkinson Marker. The economy has been sort of ebbing and flowing over the last 5-6 years. How do you see more macroeconomic forces impacting the capital market and availability of funds for people who want to participate in not the H-block auction that's coming up in just a few months, but more the auctions that are anticipated to occur closer to the end of 2014 or early 2015? And do you think that the success of the wireless industry and the innovation and the growth that it has been generating for the economy would overshadow any more negative macroeconomic factors that would otherwise reduce the amount of funds available?
I would probably reiterate what Lisa said earlier. Interest rates are key. Today is a very important meeting. Any thoughts on, I had Fran Shammo, the CFO of Verizon, I remember him saying, the window is now open, it's now or never, because we mean regarding Vodafone. So I think interest rates are key to the capital coming in and being invested in the sector. I'm not sure I'm answering your last on the economy.
Well, just one thought, I'm not sure this answers your question either, but one big change for Sprint in particular is SoftBank's ownership of 80%, and SoftBank has a lot of availability to borrow cheaply. And so from a dynamic of the auctions, they're all impacted by higher interest rates, yes, but we now have 3 well-capitalized bidders, and T-Mobile is well-capitalized too, but Deutsche Tel has in the past shown their cards and that they sometimes don't want to allocate money to the United States. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So, when in the few meetings I've had with SoftBank, subsequent Sprint, it sounds like they are excited and willing to spend a lot of money. And with the backing of SoftBank, I think that is going to help the industry achieve its goals, because AT&T and Verizon are extremely strong credits in the credit market relative to other companies and the investment universe. So if things get bad, they usually get hurt the least, unless we're in 2001 in that era.
And I'd also note Sprint just raised like 6.5 billion too, right? I didn't get as much press as Vodafone.
And if I may, Christine, one global macro risk that is looming is the extension of the debt limit. It's important to remember that significant investment in our infrastructure is cross-border. And having both confidence and optimism about our resiliency, our national credit markets is very important. And that policy debate, which is happening very close to you, is material, and material to our sector as well.
I just had one other thing, though. There is some talk about AT&T buying Vodafone's assets outside of the United States, and if that does happen, they're voting with their dollars, and there is some capital that would have gone into the United States from a CapEx perspective that's gone. So it's just as beneficial as SoftBank was to giving Sprint money. It should be, what AT&T is telling us, they're voting with their wallet that they would rather invest elsewhere. So that's not a good thing from an investment perspective. It might be further, it's probably an accretive transaction for them.
But what I would say that is a good thing, it has been a good thing, is this conversation. I think we're all grateful for your time, for coming to the end of our time. I want to thank each of you for taking the time to come to Washington. I think your voice and your perspective increasingly is an important one. And any framework, any platform that we at Mobile Future can give to share and deepen and broaden that dialogue and interaction within the trigonometry that I discussed, we're happy to do so. And very grateful for you to make the trip, participate in the discussion. And Roger as well for your perspectives. So on behalf of my board members at Mobile Future, our team at Mobile Future, thank you very much. And thank you all for sharing this time with us today.